Hello everyone and welcome. Sit back, relax, and get comfortable because this is a wonderful time for new stories from Yellowcat. Write your favorite stories in the comments below and maybe they'll be in our new video. Let's get started. What made you lose your job? I wasn't suited for this position. Story time. I was born and raised in the UK, but I spent almost 10 years abroad. I worked as an office administrator and PA at an accounting firm and received some bookkeeping training. It was a great job, just 2 months away from turning 9 years old. They went so far as to promise to keep the job open for me should I choose to return home. I returned to the UK in an attempt to start over after my marriage failed. To tide me over, I applied for a call center job. This was in a government organization's payroll division. In order to handle the volume of calls they would receive regarding their new operating system, they hired more than 150 summer employees. Our training consisted of spending 3 days in a sports hall close to the business park where we were given a booklet and read it aloud by a couple of staff members. At least half of the 3 days were spent playing team-building exercises, such as building the tallest tower out of dry spaghetti and marshmallows or answering 3 questions with a lie. Training on the system we would use took place on day 4. We lacked access to computers for work. Using a slide projector and screen captures, our IT guy delivered a presentation. The only computer system training we received was that. On day 5, we were able to visit the office where we would be working at last. A half day was spent in the cafeteria while ID cards were printed. The remaining half, buddy calls or shadowing. Unfortunately, our system is down until Monday, so you'll need to call back then, was the response given to the calls because the system was essentially unavailable until Monday. It was like this. In the new group of starters, I was paired up with someone who was also ahead of me by 1 day. The week that follows, I still don't have the system's login credentials. I decided to sit down and go through all of my notes, asked if there was any other administrative work I could do to pass the time, or even if I could get more buddy-up training with more seasoned clerks. Everything was turned down. I had no idea what I was doing when I finally got my login credentials. I was going through a difficult time personally, too. My marriage had broken down, I was depressed, my relationships with family members had broken down, and I was trying to start over at the age of 37, so I was understandably overwhelmed. I did my best to assist every caller, but it was obvious that I was taking too long rather than completing tasks quickly. This was a new experience for me as I had previously worked in an environment where cases involving accounting fraud or revenue claims could take weeks to resolve. We had a lengthy conversation about what could help me and decided that I should pair up with a seasoned employee for an afternoon and switch calls between us so I could gain experience that way. My goodness, what a difference it made. Spoke with my line manager. He was brand new and started the day before. Keep in mind that I'd only had my login details for a day and a half, so effectively only worked for that long. Turnaround times were significantly better, and I realized I could pull this off on my first full day on the phones by myself. It was also the first day I didn't go home feeling like a failure. I smiled as I actually said goodbye to people as I walked out. Kinda like, see you tomorrow. On the bus, I received a call. They wished for me to never return. My Beatles coffee mug was stolen by thugs, which was the worst part. Edit to add, 70 of the 150 hires left before the first week ended. One employee stormed out after arguing with the boss about how bad the training was, and another 40 quit before the end of week 2. I had a falling out with 3 of my bosses because I voiced my disapproval of the way they were treating us workers. When I objected to their stereotypes, I was shamed by one for the kind of bread I ate. I spoke up. Because it seems that women shouldn't eat a certain kind of bread, or when I voiced my disapproval of the disrespectful treatment I was receiving. Every employee had a supervisor who was detested by all because she was the most unjust and conceited person ever. As a result, she was gossiped about behind everyone's backs. I requested that she not be treated like a butler or summon, but rather like a regular human being. She humiliated us in front of the customers and other staff members by shaming us if we were doing something wrong and didn't just tell us to carry on as usual. We had a conversation about that with an HR representative in attendance. Everything's fine, no issues there now. Then his superiors almost fired the most important person there, the big boss, for not working. Rather than making any changes, he had recorded conversations with each employee, making as much trouble as he could to present a positive image of himself. When I first started working there, I made a specific inquiry about smoke breaks. If I asked someone and there was no customers around, it was fine to do so. Remember, the man smoked outside for about 20 minutes every hour. So when I asked for a break to have a cigarette, I was given the all clear to go outside, smoke, and return. Then, since I didn't take a break, I got chewed out afterwards. Almost all people I worked with all have left or been fired, and from the few who are still there, I've heard it's even worse now. When my boss was being careless, he threw me under the bus to hide it. It worked for about 4 to 5 months, but he finally caught up with him. As it turns out, it's hard to blame someone else when he does all of the work in the store's backroom himself and $20,000 to $30,000 worth of inventory goes missing, and a lot of the general paperwork he was in charge of is missing, incomplete, or full of mistakes. I was only hired because I'd been in charge of most of those jobs before and had trained him. I found out while I was at the other store in the city. Their assistant manager was the person I was hoping they'd send to run my store before we got the Jack-A. It turned out that she wasn't there. She was down at the new location where everything happened. I was so happy that I did a little dance, took the bus to the other store, and bought her tea to treat her. After about 2 to 3 years, the business shut down. It looks like my store wasn't the only one with problems with inventory, missing or incomplete paperwork, etc. The owners of a small retail store were in the process of opening a second location when I was working there as a manager. I had a friend named James, who was a hard worker and had a background in construction. He was hired to do a lot of work to the new location, including laying the floor, building a custom counter, and other things. According to the contract, he would receive $16,000 once the work was finished. James diligently worked on this project for a period of 3 months, and he did an outstanding job. The proprietors were pleased with the work that was completed. However, they chose not to pay him. Yes, he ought to have requested a portion of the payment in advance and done a few things differently, but that's not really my business. What is my business is the fact that I was working for scumbags who took advantage of a hard-working individual who kept his end of the bargain. On a particular evening, James and I were hanging out and enjoying a few drinks when he called once more to inquire about his payment. "Go ahead and sue us. We know you don't have the money to fight our lawyers, so you won't get anywhere," the owners told him in a direct manner before hanging up the phone during the conversation. So I decided to call. And the very first words that came out of my mouth were something along the lines of, "Listen here, you filthy mother effer." Over the phone, I was terminated from my position. Within a period of 6 months, James and I were able to put these jerks out of business by opening our very own retail store as a form of competition. At both of these locations. Karma's a bee. How do you deal with your terrible HOA or neighbor? My spouse and I recently relocated from a town of 3,000 people to an apartment in a city of 175,000. When the couple who lived downstairs, who were a few years older than us, introduced themselves and asked us over for drinks that evening, we were taken aback. After hanging out with them and having a good time, we left to go home. A few days later, the same thing takes place. Before we know it, they're inviting us to their apartment for drinks 5 nights a week. For a few weeks, we might go a few times a week. The woman then begs us not to fire her if we allow her to borrow $20 for gas money so she can get to work. We concede and give it to her. They invite us to go play pool somewhere that same evening. After we leave, they continue to order drinks for the rest of the evening, costing between $20 and $40. We don't hang out with them for about a week because my wife and I are pretty irritated, but since they're the only friends we have, we forgive them. The following time we hang out, they're talking about finding some illegal substances and smoking, so we leave. They beg us for money again the following day, but we refuse and choose to stay away from them. Over the course of the following few weeks, they will not stop hounding us to hang out, playing loud music after we say no, leaving the door and blinds open so they can harass us whenever we leave, yelling insults about us to each other, loud enough for us to hear, pleading with us for more money, bringing us food they've grilled on occasion because they thought we might like some, then yelling about us some more when we decline politely, inviting us to their wedding, and when we say no, pouring soda all over our car. Lastly, we report the last one to the apartment manager for vandalism, which, along with numerous other infractions, results in their eviction. They then extend an invitation to visit their new home, which is 30 minutes away in a different town. We keep seeing them drive by our apartment, slowly trying to get a good look. We receive several Facebook requests in the next year, and I guess they finally get the hint and leave us alone. The neighbors who lived behind our house were under the impression that the wisteria that was growing along the fence was actually a weed, and they attempted to persuade us to do away with it. We refused to comply, and they actually cut down a couple of branches, which resulted in us involving the neighborhood association and threatening to take legal action against them. We were successful in getting the association to rule in our favor because the wisteria was not causing any allergic reactions, it was not damaging the fence, and it was, as they put it, improving the neighborhood aesthetically and by attracting beneficial insects. As a token of their appreciation for the branches they had cut down, they presented us with a brand new wisteria and assured us that they would not mess it up again. Therefore, we now had 2 wisterias, although the new one is still quite small and it'll take a few years before it reaches a size that is even remotely comparable to the one that was here before. We have a backyard very similar to yours with a number of fruit trees and a large number of raised gardens for vegetables. Despite the fact that we have grass, a real estate agent who are also close friends of our family have informed us that fruit trees and established garden beds can actually be a selling point for our home if they're sold to the right buyers. To be sure, they will always be people who favor a yard consisting solely of grass, but if you have spent hundreds of dollars and years cultivating fruit trees, you're not going to want to sell them to someone who's likely to destroy them after the sale. With all kinds of threats about liens and everything else, our homeowners association HOA costs about $250 per year in dues. During the 3 years that we lived in that house and attempted to be active members of the community, they held 4 meetings. However, none of them were successful in accomplishing their goals. To accomplish anything, we required the participation of at least 10 households, and in most cases, we only received 5. 4 months ago, we learned that we're going to be moving, and we made the decision to rent out our home so that someone else would be responsible for paying our mortgage rather than trying to sell it. After making a phone call to the organization that was representing our HOA, we discovered that the organization had been dissolved without informing any of the members. Only the president and vice president were informed. I made my way over to the president's residence and inquired about the whereabouts of all the annual dues, as well as the reason why no one had been informed. He stated that the HOA's charter said that the organization would be dissolved if it was found to be ineffective. Specifically, the money was utilized in order to terminate the contract with our management company at an earlier date. My dad has always had a knack for growing plants. He made the decision to buy his current home so that he could take advantage of the lovely backyard it offered. Each of his 7 fruit trees, as well as his numerous vegetable gardens and flower gardens, are surrounded by ample space. It turns out that a neighbor saw his back lot on Google Maps and came to the conclusion that the absence of grass in his backyard made the entire development unattractive and was causing everyone's home values to decrease. The neighbor was successful in persuading the Homeowners Association HOA to compose a formal letter of complaint in which the HOA instructed my father to sow grass and destroy his gardens and fruit trees. The HOA had no legal standing, so my dad lawyered up and told them to suck it. Our first homeowners association was managed by a corporation, and they would send you letters and legal threats on a regular basis, sometimes for things that were not in violation of the deed restrictions, and they would charge you fees for those things. I abhorred it. I detested it. After I hired my own attorney and spent approximately $1,000 to send them several cease and desist letters, and after I threatened to sue them for harassment and discrimination, I was less than half the age of the average homeowner in the area, they continued to treat me poorly until I sold my home 5 years later. Additionally, the HOA, which was the second house, was managed by a corporation as well. However, the corporation was not permitted to take any action without first receiving approval from the Board of Residents, which met every other week. Therefore, unless you were a true nuisance, you were pretty much left alone the entire time. My departure from that location was due to the restrictions they imposed on outbuildings, workshops, and garages. Currently, we reside in the countryside down a lengthy dirt road that's nearly 3/4 of a mile long and that I own. The deed restrictions only apply to what can be seen from the road through the property. The view of my land is completely obscured by 50 feet of trees and brush, and I'm located at the end of the road in question. Because of this, there's no restrictions in effect. Even in the event that I would have a problem, there are only 5 reasonable landowners, and I would only need 2 other people to vote in my favor for anything I desire. We only have 3 pages of HOA or deed restrictions, and the majority of them are restrictions on the number of farm animals that can be kept on each acre. Thank you for listening to these stories. If you want to see new videos, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to hit the like button.